On a Friday afternoon in March, Robert pulled up to his property in a flatbed truck hauling something that looked like it had spent 50 years underwater. A 1950 Case DC tractor, engine seized solid, hydraulics frozen, paint flaking off in orange sheets, worth maybe $800 as scrap metal, which was exactly what he'd paid for it. His neighbors stopped their tractors to watch. The ones working the field north of his line, the guys with the new green iron, the $500,000 John Deeres with climate-controlled cabs. They watched him roll that ancient thing off the truck like he'd just made the worst decision of his life. Some of them shook their heads. A couple of them laughed. Robert didn't hear the laughing. He was already doing the math he'd been doing for 3 weeks straight. The bank's letter sat on his kitchen table. Foreclosure notice. 90 days to settle accounts, or the property transferred to the lender. 3 weeks of breathing room left. 3 weeks to turn $800 of dead iron into something that kept him here. Sometimes the most valuable thing in a scrapyard isn't worth anything until you understand why it's there. That first morning, Robert climbed up onto the seat and started cleaning. Decades of dirt came away first, then mouse nest, dried out leather cracking under his hands. He worked methodically, the way you work when you're not sure what you're looking for, but you know it matters. His hand hit something solid wedged deep into the seat frame itself, something wrapped in oilcloth, the kind of wrapping you don't see anymore. He worked it free carefully. The cloth fell away and revealed a book, leather-bound, maybe 80 pages, handwritten entries in faded pencil and ink. The cover read, Joe Miller, 1933 to 1941. What the Bank Won't Tell You. Robert sat back on his heels and read the first entries by afternoon light. October 1929. The banks promised safety. Everyone trusted them. By March 1933, they were gone. Just gone. Doors locked, accounts frozen. Farmers with mortgages lost everything overnight. But Joe Miller had no mortgage. The ledger detailed why. As Robert read, he realized this wasn't a journal. It was a manual, a survival guide written by someone who'd kept his land when the entire system collapsed around him. The entries were practical. Crop prices, barter trades, mechanical fixes solved with salvaged parts, neighbor agreements written in plain language, each one documented. One margin note stood out, written in darker ink like Joe had underlined it for emphasis. The machine doesn't care who owns the bank. It only cares about the man holding the clutch. Robert understood something then. The 1950 case hadn't been abandoned. It had been left behind on purpose. Left for someone who would understand what it meant. Left for a moment like this one, when a farmer was out of time and out of options, and the only thing standing between him and the auctioneer was something old enough to remember the last time the banks failed. He opened the ledger to the next page and read deeper into Joe's world. The entries revealed something Robert's neighbors, the ones with their software-locked equipment and their dealer-dependent repairs, would never understand. Joe wasn't just writing about the Depression. He was writing instructions for how to survive the next one. And Robert was running out of time to learn them. Robert spent that night reading by lamplight, and the ledger began to speak. Page after page revealed a man who'd watched the entire world collapse and decided not to go with it. March 6th, 1933. The county bank closed, doors locked, accounts frozen. Joe's entries documented it plainly. Farmers with mortgages lost everything overnight. The bank took the land, the equipment, the livestock, everything. Joe had no mortgage. He'd made a different choice years earlier, back when that choice looked foolish to everyone around him. The ledger revealed why. Joe had built what he called the barter circle. 6 neighboring farms had traded goods and labor instead of using credit. Robert read the entries like they were written for him personally. Gave Henrik 2 bushels of oats for fence repair. Gave Mary 2 days of plowing for 3 chickens and 6 eggs. Traded timber to the blacksmith for a new plow blade. The genius of it wasn't kindness. It was obligation. Everyone knew exactly what they owed and when it was due. The difference was simple. Bank debt demanded cash during a collapse. You didn't have cash, you lost everything. Barter debt could be paid in goods or work when money didn't exist at all. One margin note caught Robert's eye. Joe's handwriting was thick with conviction. The bank calls this primitive. I call it survival. The ledger showed a farm that looked nothing like the monoculture operations surrounding it. Joe kept hogs, cream cows, chickens, bees, timber, grain, and a vegetable garden. When corn prices collapsed to 8 cents a bushel, barely enough to pay for the seed, Joe didn't panic. He'd never depended on corn alone. One entry read simply, "Lost the corn crop to rust, but the hogs are fat, the bees filled 2 boxes, and the timber is worth more than it was last year." Then came the machinery entries. In 1950, Joe purchased a 1950 Case DC for $2,400. The description was almost defiant. "The last machine I'll ever need to buy if I keep my hands on it." Below that, in the same steady pencil, 33 horsepower of pure mechanical truth. No wires to cut, no computer to fail. A man and a machine and the work between them. Joe's rule about parts became clear as Robert read deeper. Never buy what you can forge, salvage, or trade for. The dealer is a middleman who profits from your desperation. The ledger detailed how Joe fixed the case. Salvaged parts from scrapyards. Blacksmith work done in trade. A machinist 2 counties over who Joe'd helped through a hard winter. He bored the cylinders and honed the rings in exchange for grain and labor. By 1940, Joe had built a quiet reputation. The entries noted it. When the case breaks, I fix it. When anyone else's breaks, they call the dealer and wait. Robert understood what that meant. When your neighbors depended on dealers, they were hostages to service schedules. When Joe kept his own equipment running, he was free. The final entries from 1941 showed a farm thriving while neighbors were still drowning in debt. The bank is gone, the barter circle is stronger, and the case runs like it did the day I bought it. Robert closed the ledger and stared at the case sitting dark in his yard. Joe Miller had written this ledger in the depths of catastrophe and left it where someone would find it. Someone like Robert. Someone running out of time. Someone who needed to understand that the old ways weren't primitive. They were the only ways that actually survived. Robert placed the ledger on his kitchen table next to the foreclosure notice. He looked at the dates. The notice was dated March 15th, 2024. 91 years to the month after Joe watched the banks close their doors. The parallel hit him like something physical. The modern farm crisis looked nothing like the 1930s on the surface. There were no dust storms, no bank holidays, no lines of farmers at courthouse auctions. But the structure underneath was identical. Debt-fueled expansion, price collapse, forced consolidation. Robert had lived the first part of that pattern. 10 years ago, he had taken out loans to buy new equipment, not because he wanted to expand, because his neighbors were expanding. And you can't compete with last year's mentality. When everyone around you is buying bigger equipment and taking out bigger loans and betting on higher yields, you do the same or you fall behind. The bank encouraged it. The equipment dealers encouraged it. Everyone said the same thing: get bigger or get out. Then commodity prices dropped 40% in 2 years. The debt didn't drop with them. The loans remained fixed, immovable, demanding. $300,000 in borrowed money, secured against land that was suddenly worth less. The bank's solution, when he had asked for a conversation about it, was always the same: consolidate, specialize, get bigger. Like size was the answer to a problem that size had created. Robert opened Joe's ledger again and read an entry he'd marked with his thumb. Joe's handwriting, 1935. The bank says I must choose, grow or die, but I choose neither. I choose to own what I have. The pressure was the same in 1933. The outcome would have been the same too, if Joe had played by the rules. But modern farms had a different kind of trap, one Joe had never faced: software locks, equipment that couldn't be repaired without dealer codes, a $500,000 John Deere that sat idle for 3 weeks waiting for a technician to drive out and plug in a computer. The 1950 case in Robert's yard could be fixed with a hammer, a wrench, and knowledge. That knowledge mattered. It was freedom. It was independence. The ledger's barter system seemed ancient until Robert thought about what was actually happening in modern farming. CSA subscriptions, farmers markets, direct-to-consumer beef sales, direct cream sales. These weren't quaint nostalgia. They were Joe's barter circle, modernized. Same principle: cut out the middleman, capture the full price, build obligation and relationship instead of anonymous transactions. The diversification principle was identical too. Joe had kept hogs, cream, eggs, timber, grain. He never depended on one crop, one buyer, one price. A farm dependent on a single commodity was a farm one bad harvest away from collapse. That lesson hadn't changed at all. Near the back of the ledger, in what might have been Joe's final entry, Robert found a margin note written darker than the rest. The pencil pressed harder. The next crash will come. Not in my lifetime, but it will come. Leave this book for whoever needs it. Robert sat back and understood what he was holding. Joe Miller hadn't just survived the 1930s. He'd built a system designed to survive any crash, any collapse, any moment when the modern world stopped working and people had to remember what the old world knew. The ledger wasn't history. It was a blueprint. But the real question was simple: could it actually work today? Robert decided to test Joe's philosophy. He started with the case. The tractor hadn't run in decades. The engine was seized solid, hydraulics frozen, the wiring corroded to nothing. Most people would have called it scrap. Robert called it a problem he could solve with his own 2 hands and the ledger under his arm. He began with Joe's first rule: never buy what you can salvage. The next Saturday, he spent the morning in scrapyards an hour from home. He found a seized case from 1948, pulled from an estate sale, destined for the crusher. He bought it for $300 and hauled it back. Hydraulic hoses he salvaged from old combines at farm equipment auctions, a generator from a dead thresher, an alternator from a John Deere that had been abandoned in a field for a decade. The real breakthrough came when he found the machinist, not a dealer, not some corporate service center. An old man named Walter who ran a small shop out of a barn 2 towns over. The kind of place that still existed if you knew where to look. Robert explained what he needed. Walter looked at the case's cylinders and said, "I can bore those for you." He didn't ask for payment up front. He didn't schedule it out weeks in advance. He asked when Robert could bring it by. The conversation went like this. "What do you need for it?" Walter said. "Come harvest time, I'll need help getting my grain cut. Couple days of work." That was the trade. That was Joe's system, written in a handshake. The restoration took 3 months. Robert spent weekends pulling the engine, cleaning every passage, fitting salvage parts into spaces that didn't quite accommodate them at first, learning how to make old iron speak to other old iron. Walter bored the cylinders in the off-season. An electrician Robert knew from church rebuilt the generator for a case of canned tomatoes from Robert's mother-in-law. A welder fixed the cracked frame in exchange for help moving a shed. By the time the case fired up in June, that first catch of the engine, rough and uneven, then settling into a rhythmic chuff, Robert had spent less than $2,000 in actual cash. Most of it was gasoline and welding supplies. The labor was traded. The knowledge was free, passed from man to man the way it had been for 70 years before software existed. As the case came alive, Robert began implementing Joe's other lessons on the farm itself. He started a barter circle with 3 neighboring farms, a dairy operation, a vegetable grower, and a small livestock producer. He wrote out a simple agreement, documented it in a ledger just like Joe's, and they each signed it. The terms were clear. Fair trades, documented. No mystique, no confusion. Robert planted cover crops. He rotated fields instead of monoculture. He kept chickens, bees, and a small herd of heritage pigs. He installed a belt-driven mill powered by the case's PTO, the power takeoff shaft that ran off the engine, and began processing his own grain. That one decision cut his milling costs by 30%. The commercial mill in town took their cut every time. Robert kept it. Word moved quietly through the farming community the way word actually moves. One struggling neighbor noticed Robert was still here. Another saw the barter circle growing. They asked questions. Robert showed them the ledger. He didn't lecture. He just showed them what was actually working. Within 6 months, the barter circle had grown to 7 farms. Within a year, 12. Robert documented every trade in his ledger, just as Joe had. One entry from that first year mirrors something Joe wrote. The bank called today. Asked how I'm still operating. I told them the truth. I'm not operating. I'm surviving. There's a difference. The 1950 case became the centerpiece of his operation, not because it was romantic or nostalgic, but because it was the only equipment he truly owned and could truly control. When a bearing failed, he replaced it himself with a salvage part and 4 hours of work. When a neighbor's $500,000 tractor broke down, they called the dealer and waited 3 weeks for a technician. Robert fixed his in an afternoon. The ledger's prophecy was proving true. Old iron didn't just run, it freed you. The bank's representative arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after the foreclosure notice was dated. His name was David Chen. He was young, efficient, armed with spreadsheets, and the kind of certainty that comes from never having built anything with his own hands. He'd come to finalize the foreclosure. That's what his email said. He walked the property expecting to find a failing operation, a man in denial, equipment gathering rust, the typical slow collapse that gave the bank permission to take the land. Instead, he found something else entirely. The 1950 case was running a belt-driven mill, processing grain for the barter circle. 3 neighboring farmers were there, unloading sacks of wheat, their trucks lined up casual, the kind of scene that happens when people have worked together through seasons. The fields were in rotation, some planted, some in cover crops, some in rest. Livestock moved through pastures in patterns that meant someone understood soil health and recovery. The processing shed was clean, organized, running. David Chen walked that property in silence. Robert let him walk. When he came back, David asked a simple question. How are you still here? Robert didn't pull out financial statements. He showed in the ledger, the one he'd kept, just like Joe kept his. Every trade documented, every exchange recorded, the income streams visible and tangible, the debt decreasing by 6% that year alone. This isn't sustainable, David said, but his voice had changed. You're operating outside the system. I'm operating inside a different system, Robert said quietly. One that doesn't require the bank to exist. David threatened foreclosure. He said the numbers didn't align with standard agricultural models. He said the diversification was inefficient. He said Robert was behind the times. Then Robert pulled out a document from the back of Joe's ledger, a legal framework that Joe had annotated decades ago, a structure called a private agricultural trust. The property wasn't solely Robert's anymore. It was held in collective trust by the 12-farm barter circle. Foreclosing on Robert meant foreclosing on 12 farms, which meant 12 separate legal battles, which meant costs that exceeded what the land was worth. David Chen looked at that document for a long time. He never came back. Within 3 months, Robert's loan was sold to a different lender. Within 6 months, the new lender offered him a restructuring. Not out of kindness, out of mathematics. Robert's operation was stable, diversified, networked. The risk profile had changed. The threat had evaporated. By the following spring, Robert had bought back most of his debt at a discount. The barter circle had grown to 30 farms across 3 counties. Other struggling farmers had heard the story and started their own collectives. The 1950 case had become something unexpected, not a symbol of nostalgia, but a symbol of quiet revolution. Not against the system, around it. Robert placed his own ledger next to Joe's on the workbench. They looked almost identical. Same leather binding, same handwritten entries, same philosophy of documentation and reciprocal obligation. The only difference was time. Robert understood what Joe had done. He'd left a blueprint, not just for survival, but for independence. For anyone who would find it. For any moment when the modern world stopped working and people remembered that the old world knew something essential. The 1950 case still runs in Robert's yard, maintained with salvaged parts and mechanical skill. The barter circle has grown to 30 farms. Robert has started leaving copies of both ledgers in strategic places, under tractor seats, in barn rafters, wrapped in oilcloth. Because the next crash will come. It always does. And when it does, someone will find a ledger and understand. The old ways weren't primitive. They were resilient. Subscribe to see what happens when the system breaks and the old iron keeps running.